Hello, today I will be showing you how CPM actually works running an emulator, and I hope you will enjoy it. But first of all, let's start the emulator and enter basic. Okay, so first of all, there are many ways to run CPM. However, I have tested them, and to me it seems that the best way to attempt running such an operating system is to actually use an emulator for Z80 machine. And for this task I have chosen Wiki'd, which is an Amstrad CPC emulator. The Amstrad CPC is of course a Z80 machine that has 64, 128 kilobytes of memory or even more, is able to run CPM using disk images, and most of the tasks that you are going to see while running CPM will be pertaining to this particular installation and configuration. I know that there are other CPM emulators like 22Nice, MyZ80 and CMage. I still think that Wiki'd has a very good set of features which, while not making it perfect, are going to be entirely suited for the current purpose of running CPM, seeing it in the best of light as far as I can tell in the current circumstances. So, first of all, we have a basic installation. It's the Amstrad CPC with the 64 kilobytes of memory. There are two disk drives that are going to be used. One of them is actually mandatory because running loading the CPM still requires some specific configuration. The second drive is going to be the application disk. This is typical of many CPM machines because ultimately with such a limited amount of storage you could not use just a single floppy disk drive, or you could, but it's not advisable. Think about the fact that most floppy disk drives would have at most 360 kilobytes of available space, and considering the fact that just installing CPM actually takes almost 100 kilobytes, you have very little space to actually run your applications and to keep your files. So using the two floppy disk drive machines was actually important, just as it was for the first MS-DOS machines. However, the difference is that later on we had the possibility of running DOS with a hard disk drive. With these machines, with these 8-bit machines, running with a hard disk drive was much more difficult. It was not impossible, but it depended on much more aspects that had to be set up. And in general, using CPM was not particularly straightforward with such a configuration. And since there are so many issues, I cannot show you this particular configuration, although I made previous attempts. Alright, so first of all, in order to show you properly what happens, we have to enter CPM. There are various commands that can be used in order to initiate CPM. In this case, we are going to use a less cryptic command, but still cryptic to some extent. We are going to use run C. C is the name of a file that is stored on the first floppy disk drive. Alright, so let's enter the command. And as you can see, there is a fast loader, fast screen mentioned that quickly disappears. This is a particular loader that I noticed through many attempts and tests, that it has a noticeable improvement in terms of how quickly CPM launches and how quickly screen updates are being made. So I think it's very good considering the fact that we are still running it on a 3.5 MHz processor, so quite slow compared with the general, let's say, configuration that was possible with MS-DOS machines. So in this case, everything that can speed up a bit some way in which the system runs is actually very useful. Alright, the CPM loader ended, and then it switched to loading the actual CPM files. We have two disk drives, A and B. As you actually notice on the screen, there is part of the configuration that is quite obvious. There are two disk drives, 61 kilobytes of total process memory available, that is TPA, out of 64. And we have some files that have already been executed in order to set up the configuration. It's important to have a custom configuration because ultimately it's very difficult to run CPM in a satisfactory manner. You have to think that CPM was even more, let's say, difficult in how some things were handled compared with MS-DOS. And MS-DOS wasn't great either in the first instances that were released. So we have to take these limitations into account. One of the most important ones is the fact that with an emulator, and in general just about any system you may consider, any hardware configuration, you have a different keyboard layout. I have made many attempts at trying to use a keyboard layout both in CPM and in other applications that would be quite acceptable in most circumstances. And I thought about having some shortcuts, some keyboard mappings that are actually better than the ones that were already active while running CPM. This is helpful because if you are used to DOS, then some commands are actually much more obvious to use in this context than using the arcane method of entering particular commands in CPM. Of course, not everything is perfect. You still have to contend with the peculiarities of CPM. However, it goes on to show what I'm going to present further, the fact that it's possible to run CPM and it's possible to see a lot of interesting aspects. What I would like to add further is the fact that CPM is the missing link between computers as you probably experienced them with cassettes or disk drives running games, running applications, and the full operating system that later was the basis, the foundation for modern computing, which meant MS-DOS, Microsoft Windows, and other similar operating systems or graphical interfaces that we have seen. And in this context, CPM is very important because few people are aware, at least today, that CPM existed, and everything that we came to know as MS-DOS was actually based on CPM. In fact, MS-DOS was a clone of CPM when it was purchased by Microsoft and later sold as PC-DOS. And I think that those principles are actually very important. So let me show you what is stored on each floppy disk drive and then continue presenting other aspects pertaining to CPM. The command syntax is somewhat similar to MS-DOS, however there are some differences that you should be aware of. Sometimes the order of operands is the opposite of MS-DOS. In other situations there are similar commands but they are named differently and so on. The most obvious one and the most useful one is dir, which offers a listing of what happens on what is stored on any disk drive. We see the listing presented over here, and we notice some files that seem somewhat similar to MS-DOS and some that seem totally different. The COM extension is very well known to any person that attempted to run games in DOS. It's a typical command file, one that is not particularly large. There is a limitation on the size of COM files. I don't know exactly how large they could be in CPM, but those limitations have actually been carried out throughout the entire MS-DOS existence, even if probably the limitations could have been different in terms of the actual file size. What matters, however, is the fact that applications need to be started by using this binary format. And then you have other files that are useful for various purposes. For instance, each and every time when you're going to start CPM, you're going to need a particular file, a system file known as the AMS file. This has to reside on a particular sector of your disk in order to be booted as needed. It's C10 CPM3. Yes, we are talking about CPM3, the last version of CPM. That I think was released around the beginning of 1980s. In 1983, actually, digital research ended development of CP/M. So probably CP/M3 was released roughly in the first years of 1980s. So we are talking about a very old operating system, but there are some aspects that are still relevant even today, and it's one of the reasons why I'm showing you CP/M and have made the attempt at presenting all these details. And you see other files like c.bin, which, if you remember correctly, I used in order to launch the fast loader that later loaded CP/M. This was actually a way to handle starting the CP/M operating system back then, although some other machines used particular commands like print user or any other way of bootstrapping or starting CP/M. And there are many aspects that are somewhat similar and somewhat different to MS-DOS, as mentioned. There is a file that runs each and every time the system is started. I think it's the profile.sub file, which is similar to autoexec.bat. It has a context that I will present to you. It runs after the boot and enters any particular commands pertaining to configuration. In this case, the first command being run is set keys, which actually changes the mapping of various keys in order to be better useful with a keyboard for an IBM PC. Of course, the keyboard of an IBM PC is not known to the emulator, but the emulator can make certain key bindings slightly better. Of course, the keyboard is different, so we don't have very many options in this respect. Another command that is being run is setdef, which creates the order of the disk drives and then the order of running files. And this is very important because in general you should run the batch file first if it's going to be found in a specific path, and then you should launch if no subfile or batch file is being presented with a particular file being given in a command to look for the com file. Because in this way you can automate certain ways in which the application is being started. And I think this is very important because you have to think that any application actually has its own configuration. Running a particular program in CP/M meant probably getting to understand and use so many conventions that were particular to a specific application. And this meant that in general you would have to contend with many shortcuts, many ways in which you could not launch directly a particular program in order to open a specific file, as you are very well used to relatively modern MS-DOS. And using batch files we can make easier these tasks. So the first and the most typical application you would run in CP/M is a text editor, and text editors were quite popular, and especially one particular text editor rose to fame, that is WordStar. Of course, this software did not have great life later in MS-DOS, but it was a staple of CP/M, and I think that this is very important. You could also have spreadsheet applications, database programs, programming language, let's say development environment like using Pascal, using C, using Fortran, and all the other languages that you might consider, including BASIC. And you also had games and applications that could use the graphic functions. However, due to the limitation of many 8-bit machines, graphic capabilities were rarely available, and since you would need a particular configuration for each and every machine in order to be supported and work fast enough, this was not popular. And also the fact that, of course, CP/M development ended in 1983 meant that most programs that could take advantage of these capabilities were entirely out of discussion. And of course, the 8-bit computers did not have an additional operating system that could take the place of CP/M. Even if in theory you could run even graphical interfaces. And GEOS for the Commodore 64 actually proved that it was possible to run such a graphical interface on an 8-bit machine. But getting back to limitations of typical CP/M machines, you would have to contend with them, and in general text mode applications were the most popular. So let me show you how the profile actually looks, or the batch file that is being run when the system is initialized. The way in which we enter command is similar to MS-DOS. However, as mentioned, sometimes there are differences. In this case, I'm going to use a text editor, not necessarily WordStar, because WordStar is slower to start. I'm going to use a text editor that was developed, I think, somewhere in the early 2000s, and it's very nice. Of course, doesn't have support for very large files, but it shows very well what we need. So we are going to type the application name and then the name of the file we want to work. And as you're going to notice, it's already going to use a specific key mapping and then load the file. These are the commands being used. They are entirely what you have seen running before. So there is no surprise over here. However, I would like to show to you how a modern application could look modern for most situations. It has a menu. Of course, menus were typically used with other applications, but I think it's also quite fast, and this matters the most. Let me think a bit. I think keys.sc is a file. Alright, this is a typical remapping of keys. On the left are the actual keys that are going to be used, as far as I can tell, on the actual hardware, and on the right is the key codes that are going to be simulated in the application. Just about any application that can start on CP/M can have these key mappings, and they are very important because in many ways they can simplify the way in which you interact with an application. As you notice from my comments, because I also left comments, the key mapping are changed to some, let's say, relatively standard key combinations that were used from one point further in most operating systems. For instance, Control O is open, Control W is close, although you could also say Control X, but it doesn't matter. There are some situations where opening a file or closing it has a specific key binding that is going to overlap another one. So we have to make some compromises in these situations. Escape, Tab, Del, Backspace, because you also want to use the one on the keyboard and not one that is mapped to another place. In this case, the emulator. Open file, abandon file, and so on. There are very many combinations that you have to keep into mind, and if I'm pressing the cursor keys, because this is also very important, you can see that I'm scrolling the file upper and lower. This is actually very fast for a program, and I'm going to show you a slower program, but one that has much more features. So these are the basic commands you can enter, and this is how it's going to show. So escape, and I'm going to exit the program to show you something else. Notice that the moment I'm exiting the program, the set of keys is updated to the one that is used when starting the system, because just about any application that runs could revert back to a key combination that is different to the one we want. And in this case, running the application and then exiting it using the specific batch file I presented to you, in this case for the application. Let me see. So it's ta.sub. And as you can see, it runs the application after setting the key bindings from one of the locations, opens the files if I have specified one, And then after exiting the program, because it waits until the application exits, and then when the program exits, it starts and works with the next commands that are from line 4 to line 5. So in this case, you can see how it works. This was actually typical of applications, but it's a method of running them that is different and more modern than the one we used before. So let's exit the application and then let's see something else. I'm going to run in this case WordStar, because it's another text editor that I think was very important, and I will show you how it works with a specific file. You're even going to notice modern features like word wrapping and others that you may not have thought about being available on such old operating systems. But actually CPM and software developed for CPM could have been very capable. Of course, the difference was if the developer spent enough time in order to optimize and think about the interface. So let's run the famous WordStar. And I think it's good to not only open the program, but also show you a file. And I'm thinking right now what should be. I think this is the file that we are going to send, but however, let me show you first of all what we are having on drive B, because it's not on drive A, the file that I'm going to show. However, it will run from there. You can see it's ideas.txt, which is actually a file that I have prepared well in this circumstance. So ideas.txt, and let's see if it can run. If not, then probably I should have specified the drive before, but let's see if it works. The program runs and it spends some time before it's going to be available. As you can see, it handled very well. It searched the file on the A drive, it didn't find it. It moved on to the B drive and then opened it. The file I'm showing you is very simple, but the length of it, you're going to be surprised that it's that easy to work with. You notice that scrolling is slower than on the other text editor, but this text editor can handle very large or long files, and this was typical of the way in which some users were working with their machines. And let me see, I think I can also go page up, page down. I think that this way, let's see. And you can see by pressing on this case on my keyboard, not the cursor keys, but Shift plus the cursor keys, I can move very easily with a similar key combination as the page up, page down on a real computer. In this case, I am mapping it to move quickly on the screen. And you can see that it's updating the screen quite quickly. And if I were to write a bit on this file, because I can also make an attempt at using it this way. You can see the cursor keys. I should have presented the interface before. There is a very large part that shows the main menu and various commands. Some of them are not particularly available because keys have been remapped, but you can see quite clearly what capabilities you have. And if I'm going to press a key, the repeat is going to work quite quickly. And of course, probably this is what happens because I have used word wrap, but I should have been paying attention not to type such a long word, because in this case it was split differently. Let's make the attempt. The limitation is quite close to where you see on the screen is actually where the R mark is being pressed, so left to right. You also see the tab stop jump positions, and I'm going to show you immediately what we are seeing. And if you see, very quickly it jumped on the next line. And think about the fact that if I'm going to save this file and then load it again, it's going to show the same structure. So the program is very powerful in the way in which it handles various texts. It's not particularly fast, but it's very powerful. And this is what I wanted to show to you, that CPM was not as limited as you may have considered. Okay, and then let's see what else I can show to you. If I want to write text that is arranged differently, I think, let's see. If I was pressing tab, and I jumped to the next tabbing position, and it's quite easy to do that. Think about all these capabilities that we grew so accustomed to being available on a program in the early 80s on an 8-bit computer that obviously was much cheaper than an IBM PC. And I think that this was actually fantastic. However, very few persons knew back then that they could do such tasks. Of course, they should have invested more in their computer because most computers could not run CPM out of the box. They would have had to use floppy disk drive add-ons if the machines were not sold with floppy disk drives, and CPM would have to be purchased and installed separately. So there were some tasks that would have been made, and of course WordStar was commercial software that would have to be purchased as well and then installed on the machine. But however, if you think about all this capability that was available on a machine that was only a quarter or even less the cost of an IBM PC, you can see what was the value proposition of using CPM on such machines. Unfortunately, as mentioned, very few people were aware or tried to run such operating systems, and in general the 8-bit machines are mostly well known for games and let's say very simple applications that were not running in CPM. Of course, CPM was more demanding, and this meant that some application developments were not particularly attractive. The market was much smaller, as mentioned. It was not popular to run CPM on many machines, and there were other limitations that ultimately meant that launching such a software for multiple machines was not as easy as it was later with DOS, because all machines were similar. On the other hand, 8-bit machines were not similar or had very limited similarity between various products. So if you have a different manufacturer, you would have to have some ways of handling escape sequences and other particular aspects pertaining to how the machine was being configured that were different from one to the others. And also, disk drive formats were different from one machine to another, even if they use the same storage medium. So this market fragmentation meant that the potential for CPM was never attained, and CPM actually died before the beginning of 1990s. However, this goes on to show what could have been done using a CPM. And think about companies that got to be quite successful by selling CPM programs. For instance, Microsoft at one point sold Multiplan, which later was transformed into Microsoft Excel, a program that we know very well. WordStar, as mentioned, wasn't very successful on the IBM PC because the competition was very strong and it developed in a very different way. But there were other applications that went on to become successful. For instance, think about AutoCAD. AutoCAD was released for the CPM, the first version, and later was released on the IBM PC for DOS. So actually there was an evolution in some cases for software developers that started on the 8-bit machines. However, in most cases, the competition and the way in which it was handled was so different on the IBM PC, and this meant that very few companies had as much success. And in terms of the programming language, yes, Microsoft was successful and sold development systems for CPM as well as for the IBM PC. And there was also the base that was a famous database application that started life on CPM and very successfully transitioned to the IBM PC and running on those. So actually there was quite an important way in which the market was first established on CPM, even if it was very short-lived. However, as noted, there are very many interesting aspects. If I'm going to exit now WordStar, because I wanted to show to you exactly how you can do that, and thinking that I haven't got many other things to show to you, at least at this point. As you can see, screen updates are not very slow, but they are not as fast as in the other text editor, and I'm stressing this again. Performance was different on various applications, however, capabilities were also very different, and some of them were important. If you wanted to print a file, or using some other routines that are useful for document organization, you could do some of these from WordStar. For instance, I think that okay, I don't want to open another file. Control O. Let's see. Yes, the quick menu. And as you can see, you have so many other shortcuts that you can use. In general, using a program meant that you would have to memorize all these shortcuts or write them somewhere. However, the performance and the capability was there, and it was very important. Okay, if I'm going to exit WordStar because I mentioned this, it's actually a much more complex program that has various ways in which to format your document before preparing it for print. However, I think I've shown to you enough about CPM, and I think you got the idea of what to expect. So let's exit WordStar. I'm pressing Ctrl X. And this meant that the file is automatically saved. Yes. And then we can see that we got again to the command prompt. And if we are going on B, let's see how much available space we have. 480. I think it was around 482 or 481 before editing the document, but I have not run the command. All right, and if you want to get back to basic, well, there is no exit program, that no exit, let's say, function from your operating system. In general, you would have to close file, close applications, and then if you were at the prompt, you could turn off the machine. Sometimes you would have the advantage or the possibility of getting back to basic and doing something else quite quickly rather than resetting the machine. But resetting was very common. The only aspect you should keep into account is the fact that you would need to run the reset command or any other when you are entirely sure that you have closed all your files and the activity properly on your machine. In this case, I think that is amdos, the command that it will restart the machine in the typical interface. And in this case, get actually to the basic interpreter, and this means that you can run whatever you wanted. However, before doing this, I want to state again why I like so much WinApe and use this specific configuration. I think that it looks very nice. I think that this design of having a blue background with white screen looks fantastic. It's much more pleasing to the eye. The way in which the screen looks, operates, and anything else about the ease of use is very good, and I think that these are advantages that are very important for an emulator and for using CPM. And moreover, you can edit the disk images from this machine, and I will show you immediately how. Let me remember it a bit. Okay, this is the profile I'm using. It's actually useful for persons that want to mimic the same configuration. However, it's not important. Memory, yes, 64 plus 256 kilobytes of RAM expansion, but it's not important in this case. Okay, the key bindings that are not entirely obvious. We are not using either devices. This was a setting that remained from a different run. It's not important. Let me see, drive A, and in this case, if I'm going to go to edit disk, you're going to see the actual content. And if I remember correctly, I don't know particularly well right now, probably you could go on and enter files, add files or remove files from the system. So you can see you can delete, rename, you can do so many other tasks that are very important. And the fact that the disk emulator offers the 8-bit machine emulator offers the ability to edit disk images is essential in this circumstance. And I'm going to show you the same screen on drive B. And as you can see, it's quite clearly obvious how the information is being organized. And this is fantastic because you are going to need to have a very good and simple access to your files so that you can move them easily between your actual system and the emulated one. And in this case, you have these advantages. So I think I covered most of what I had in mind. I will get back to basic, and I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you like such videos, please comment, subscribe, and thank you very much for watching.